In today's video we will delve into terrifying case of so-called evil Barbie and Ken. Bernardo's story began in Scarborough, a quaint district nestled in the heart of Ontario, Canada, in the year 1964. He was the youngest of 3 siblings, born to Kenneth and Marilyn Bernardo. However, his arrival did not bring the happiness that one would expect. Instead, it only added to the misery of his parents' already unhappy marriage. Kenneth had been coerced into the union by Bernardo's maternal grandfather, while Marilyn had her heart set on another suitor. The marriage was a toxic cocktail of abuse and neglect. Kenneth was a monster, physically and sexually abusing his family, even going as far as to molest Bernardo's sister. Marilyn, on the other hand, was a shell of her former self, consumed by depression and often leaving her family unattended to seek solace in the company of other relatives or retreat into the basement. Despite the bleakness of his upbringing, Bernardo was determined to rise above it all and carve out a better life for himself. Little did he know that his past would come back to haunt him in the most unimaginable ways. Amidst the shattered remnants of his family life, young Paul appeared to be unfazed by the turmoil that surrounded him, exuding an air of contentment that belied his circumstances. However, his time in the Boy Scouts would prove to be a harbinger of the darkness that lay within him, as he developed an insatiable urge to ignite flames. This compulsion would later serve as a warning sign of the sinister desires that lurked beneath his seemingly carefree exterior. In the year 1981, when Bernardo was just 16 years old, fate dealt him 2 crushing blows. Firstly, he discovered that the man he had always believed to be his father was not his biological parent, causing a rift between him and his mother. Secondly, his heart was shattered when his first love, Nadine Brammer, left him for one of his closest friends. In a fit of vengeful rage, Bernardo set fire to all the gifts she had ever given him, a fiery display of his smoldering anger and resentment. Upon completing his studies at Sir Wilfrid Laurier Collegiate Institute, Bernardo found himself working for the controversial American corporation, Amway. The company's sales culture left an indelible mark on him, and he eagerly consumed books and tapes from renowned motivational speakers. Bernardo and his friends would then apply these lessons when they ventured out to bars, where they would successfully seduce many young women. However, as time passed, Bernardo's relationships grew increasingly brief, and he began to date multiple women simultaneously. In each instance, he was abusive and would threaten to end his girlfriends' lives if they dared to speak of the mistreatment they endured at his hands. As Bernardo stepped onto the campus of the University of Toronto at Scarborough, his mind was consumed by a twisted desire. He had nurtured a dark and depraved fantasy of creating a virgin farm where he could breed innocent girls to satisfy his insatiable lust for rape. His twisted desires didn't stop there, as he also derived pleasure from forceful anal sex and publicly degrading his dates. The warning signs were there, as 2 women had already obtained restraining orders against him for making obscene phone calls in 1986. It's possible that Bernardo had already begun his heinous spree of rape and destruction. The darkness that consumed him was a force to be reckoned with, and it was only a matter of time before his true nature was revealed. Karla Homolka was brought into this world in 1970. In the quaint town of Port Credit, Ontario. Her father, Karla Homolka, was a wandering salesman from Czechoslovakia, who had a penchant for the bottle. Her mother, Dorothy Seeger, was a dedicated employee at a geriatric clinic. Karla was blessed with 2 younger sisters, Lori and Tammy. Despite her father's erratic behavior, Karla was a bright child and excelled in her studies. Her father showered her with love and affection, but his drunken episodes often led to insults hurled at her and her family. During these times, he would retreat to the basement, seeking solace from the chaos he had created. As the Homolka's marriage began to crumble, Karla took on a mistress. However, instead of reacting with anger and resentment, Dorothy proposed a threesome, and life carried on as usual. Karla was a force to be reckoned with from a young age. Her stubborn and domineering nature made it difficult for her to compromise with other children, and she never shied away from speaking her mind to adults. However, as she entered Sir Winston Churchill Secondary School, Karla's behavior took a dark turn. She fell into a deep depression. Dressing in a nonconforming manner and resorting to self-harm and false suicide attempts to seek attention. As time went on, Karla's fantasies became increasingly sadistic and masochistic. But despite her inner turmoil, she managed to secure a part-time job at a pet store while still in high school. And after graduating in 1988, she landed a full-time position as a veterinary technician at Thorold Veterinary Clinic. Karla's journey was far from easy. But her determination and resilience allowed her to overcome the challenges she faced and carve out a successful career for herself. In the year 1987, Bernardo donned his cap and gown and strode confidently across the stage to receive his diploma. He had worked hard to earn his degree and was eager to begin his career as a junior accountant at the prestigious firm of Price Waterhouse. However, his romantic pursuits were not as successful. One of his former flames, the tempestuous Jennifer Thompson, had threatened to report him to the authorities. But Bernardo was not deterred. In the merry month of May, he committed the heinous act of rape not once, but twice. And in July, he attempted to do so again. It seemed that his lustful desires knew no bounds. It was in the crisp autumn air of October that fate intervened. Bernardo found himself in a hotel restaurant, and there he met the young and alluring Karla Homolka. She was but a mere 17 years of age, attending a conference for pet store enthusiasts in Scarborough. The attraction between them was instantaneous, and they consummated their passion that very night, with their friends as witnesses. From that moment on, Bernardo became the puppet master of Homolka's life. He dictated her every move, from her wardrobe to her diet to her beliefs. He even went so far as to insult her appearance, calling her fat and ugly. But unlike his previous conquests, Homolka was all too willing to submit to his sexual whims. She even kept a self-improvement list to ensure that she pleased him in every way possible.
Be a perfect girlfriend for Paul. Remember you're stupid, remember you're ugly, remember you're fat. I don't know why I tell you these things, because you never change.
However, there was one revelation that shook Bernardo to his very core. He learned that Homolka was not a virgin when they first met. This knowledge upset him greatly, but it did not end their twisted relationship. For Bernardo was a man consumed by his own desires. And nothing would stand in the way of his insatiable appetite for power and control. In the bleak winter of December, Bernardo resumed his heinous acts of rape. The Scarborough rapist had struck again. The police, in a desperate attempt to catch the perpetrator, formed a task force in March of 1988. Despite the abundance of physical evidence and a composite sketch, the investigation led nowhere. The public was kept in the dark about the sketch, and the task force was unable to make any headway. Homolka, Bernardo's accomplice, was well aware of his actions during this time. One victim even claimed that Homolka was present during her attack, filming the entire ordeal. However, the police chose to ignore these allegations, and the investigation remained stagnant. It wasn't until May of 1990 that the police decided to release the composite sketch to the public. The floodgates opened, and a deluge of tips poured in. Bernardo had quit his job and turned to smuggling cigarettes across the border to make ends meet. His friends and ex-girlfriends recognized the sketch and tried to contact the police, but their efforts were in vain. The police were inundated with tips and were unable to follow up on all of them. Finally, in November, 2 detectives paid Bernardo a visit and collected blood, saliva, and hair samples. However, it would be 2 long years before these samples were tested. The Scarborough rapist continued to terrorize the city, and the police were no closer to catching him than they were before. As the year 1990 unfolded, Bernardo's fixation on Tammy Homolka The younger sister of his accomplice grew more intense. He spent his days spying on her, plotting a twisted scheme to defile her innocence with the help of Homolka. The plan was to ensure that Tammy remained a virgin until the moment of the heinous act. Their first attempt took place during a summer trip on July 24. Homolka had stolen Valium from her workplace and laced Tammy's meal with it. However, Tammy woke up after just a minute, thwarting Bernardo's attempt to rape her. The second attempt was made on December 23. After a Christmas dinner at the Homolka family home. Homolka referred to it as a gift to Paul, to take her sister's virginity for Christmas. While their parents slept upstairs, the couple spiked Tammy's drink with sleeping pills. Once she was unconscious, they stripped her and Bernardo proceeded to rape her. Homolka held a rag soaked with the anesthetic halothane over Tammy's nose and mouth, causing her to vomit and stop breathing. Despite their efforts to revive her, Tammy passed away. At her funeral, Bernardo was caught caressing Tammy's hair as she lay in an open casket. The couple even placed a photo of themselves in the casket. They then moved to Port Dalhousie, where they filmed themselves role-playing sexual encounters between Bernardo and Tammy. Homolka played the part of her sister, even wearing her clothes to heighten the fantasy. The depravity of their actions is beyond comprehension, and the tragedy of Tammy's death is a stain on their souls that can never be erased. On a fateful day in June of 1991, Homolka extended an invitation to a young acquaintance she had made at work, referred to as Jane Doe, during the trial, to visit their new abode. Little did the unsuspecting teenager know that her drink had been spiked with halcyon, causing her to pass out. Homolka then presented Bernardo with a twisted wedding gift, the opportunity to rape their helpless victim while filming the heinous act. The following day, the victim awoke feeling ill and unaware of the unspeakable violation she had endured. Days later, Bernardo's path crossed with that of 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey, who had been locked out of her home as punishment for missing curfew. After offering her a cigarette, Bernardo led her to his car, where he brandished a knife and blindfolded her before driving her to Port Dalhousie. Homolka was informed that they had a new playmate and, shockingly, her initial response was to go back to sleep instead of checking on the victim. The couple then proceeded to rape and torture Leslie, filming the entire ordeal. When Leslie's blindfold slipped, they murdered her and kept her body in the basement while they enjoyed dinner with Homolka's family upstairs. They later dismembered her and disposed of her remains in concrete blocks, which they threw into Lake Gibson. The blocks were discovered on June 29. The same day that Bernardo and Homolka were married. In August, Jane was once again invited over. In a chilling parallel to the death of Tammy, Jane also stopped breathing during the rape, but was successfully revived. Homolka called 911. But then phoned back to say that the situation had been resolved and the ambulance was no longer needed. The depravity and cruelty of these acts are beyond comprehension, and the callousness with which they were carried out is truly chilling. On a fateful day in April of 1992, the twisted duo of Bernardo and Homolka snatched 15-year-old Kristen French from the very steps of Holy Cross Catholic Secondary School, brazenly disregarding the presence of numerous witnesses. What followed was a harrowing 3-day ordeal of rape and torture, culminating in the young girl's supposed strangulation with the same cord that had ended the life of their previous victim, Mahaffey. However, even to this day, Bernardo maintains that it was Homolka who wielded the rubber mallet that dealt the fatal blow to French, while he was out procuring sustenance for their depraved activities. Throughout her captivity, French was never blindfolded, but was instead subjected to the cruel and unusual punishment of being forced to consume copious amounts of alcohol, while being made to watch the sickening recording of Mahaffey's rape. She was also forced to submit to Bernardo's twisted desires, but as the days wore on, her spirit began to harden, and she even had the temerity to confront her captor, calling him a bastard, just like his own mother had done. In a final act of defiance, she even dared to question how his wife could bear to be in his presence. For this, she was savagely beaten before being dispatched to her final resting place. True to form, the depraved couple left French's lifeless body in their home while they went out to dine with the Homolkas, before returning to wash her remains and cut her hair, before finally disposing of her in a ditch in Burlington, near the very cemetery where Mahaffey had been laid to rest. Despite being interviewed by the police a month after French's murder, Bernardo was not considered a suspect, even after admitting to having been questioned previously in connection to the Scarborough rapes. In a final act of twisted irony, the pair even sought to change their legal name to Teal, the surname of a serial killer from the 1988 film Criminal Law. Paul's rage and hate towards women was also affecting Karla. December 27 was a day that Homolka would never forget. Bernardo had unleashed his fury upon her with a flashlight, leaving her with a battered body and 2 black eyes. Despite the pain and trauma, Homolka tried to conceal her injuries and returned to work on January 4, 1993. She hoped to pass off her bruises as the result of a minor traffic accident, but her co-workers were not fooled. They knew something was amiss and alerted her parents, who immediately rushed to her side. Homolka's parents were shocked and horrified by the extent of her injuries. They insisted on taking her to the hospital, where she finally revealed the truth about her abusive partner. Karla claimed to be a battered spouse and filed charges against Bernardo, who was swiftly arrested. As fate would have it, the timing of Bernardo's arrest could not have been more fortuitous. Just as he was being taken into custody, the samples he had given 2 years earlier were being tested. The results were conclusive: Bernardo was the notorious Scarborough rapist. The truth had finally come to light, and justice was about to be served. Homolka's life took a drastic turn when she relocated to Brampton under the care of her aunt and uncle. She confided in them the heinous crimes committed by her partner in crime, Bernardo, who was responsible for the Scarborough rapists' reign of terror and the murders of Mahaffey and French. In a bid to secure immunity from prosecution, Homolka offered her cooperation in February, but her plea was met with a cold shoulder. Instead, she was given a week to decide between accepting a 12-year prison sentence for manslaughter or facing charges for 3 murders, including that of her own sister Tammy, whose case had just been reopened. Homolka chose the former and testified against Bernardo in his trial in 1995. The verdict was swift, and on September 1, Bernardo was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for at least 25 years. Due to the constant threats made against him, Bernardo is kept in solitary confinement, and in 1999, a group of 5 prisoners attempted to storm his segregated area, only to be dispersed by riot police. As a dangerous offender, it is highly unlikely that Bernardo will ever be granted parole. The plea deal struck by Homolka was met with widespread condemnation in Canadian society, particularly after the tapes that exposed the couple's heinous acts were played at Bernardo's trial. Some prosecutors even went as far as to say that they would never have proposed such a deal had they known what was on those tapes. Adding fuel to the fire, Bernardo's first lawyer deliberately concealed most of the tapes for a staggering 17 months, and although he was charged with obstruction of justice, he was ultimately acquitted. Karla, on the other hand, was denied parole and remained behind bars until 2005. However, her release did not come without controversy, as many believe that she had not been held accountable for her actions. In an attempt to escape the media's prying eyes, she fled to the idyllic French Caribbean island of Guadeloupe in 2007, where she tied the knot with Thierry Bordelais, the brother of her lawyer. The couple went on to have 3 children, but eventually returned to Canada and settled in Montreal. Modus operandi. Bernardo had a twisted preference for small, fair-skinned women aged between 14 and 22. Standing at a height of 5 feet 11 inches to 5 feet 3 inches and weighing between 95 to 135 pounds. He would lurk in the shadows, waiting for his unsuspecting prey to wander alone at night near his abode. Once he had spotted his target, he would trail them, observing their every move. And sometimes even capturing their every move on tape. Then, with a knife in hand, he would pounce on them, subjecting them to the most heinous of acts, anal rape. After his vile deed was done, he would flee on foot, leaving his victims to suffer in agony. Tammy Homolka and Jane Doe were not spared from Bernardo's depravity. Homolka, using chemicals stolen from her workplace, drugged and raped them in a controlled environment while Bernardo recorded the entire ordeal on video. Although they had no intention of killing them. Both women stopped breathing during the assault. The couple tried to revive them, but Tammy was beyond saving. Jane was also subjected to rape by Homolka, under Bernardo's instructions. Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French were Bernardo's next victims. He abducted them at knife point during the day, and used Homolka as bait in the second case. The two young women were forced to drink alcohol, raped, and subjected to psychological torture by both Bernardo and Homolka. Finally, they were strangled with the same electric cord. And their lifeless bodies were kept in the basement while the couple dined with Homolka's family. Later, they were abandoned outdoors, like mere trash. FBI crafted profiles for Scarborough rapist and schoolgirl killer in '88 and '92. The latter report read: typically, this type of offender starts his attacks in an area with which he is familiar. Anger is the primary behavior exhibited by the offender during his attacks, and his intent is to punish and degrade the victims, as he is angry with all women. His anger is unmistakable when observing the excessive physical force he used against the victims. The escalation in violence is observable in this series of attacks, as he was using far more physical force against the victims than was necessary to control them. Based upon our research and experience, that if confronted by a victim who vigorously resisted his attack, the offender was the type who would likely become so enraged, he could lose control and thereby become capable of unintentionally murdering the victim. The sadist achieves gratification by the victim's response to his attempts to dominate and control her, either physically or psychologically, by posing a question that would make the victim beg for her life. The first rape in St. Catherine's clearly demonstrated the same modus operandi used by the Scarborough rapist as described elsewhere in this document. This pattern is predictable in the case of the sexual sadist. Abduction of a victim virtually guarantees that murder will result. If the sexual sadist has held a victim, he feels in his own mind that he can't possibly let them go. As his fantasy escalates, he needs more control and gains that control through abduction and forcible confinement of his victims. The ultimate fantasy of a sexual sadist is to totally possess his victims, both physically and psychologically. He seeks to achieve control over their life and ultimately over their death as well. Rapists identified as sexual sadists are statistically less than 2% of all of these types of offenders. There is a high probability that the Scarborough rapist and the sexual sadistic murderer of Mahaffey and French is the same offender. Upon the apprehension of the notorious couple, Homolka proved to be a more enigmatic figure than her partner in crime, Bernardo, as per the experts. Graham Glancy, a forensic psychiatrist hired by Bernardo's defense, shed light on Homolka's psyche, stating that she exhibited traits of hybristophilia, a condition where an individual is sexually aroused by their partner's violent sexual behavior. While Bernardo's psychopathy checklist score of 35 of 40 deemed him a dangerous offender and a likely psychopath, Homolka's score of a mere 5 of 40 painted a contrasting picture. And this is how a story of evil Barbie and Ken ends. Do you think Karla got what she deserved? Let me know in the comments.
Like that is here, it's... Many neighbors just learned that through media reports this week.
I was totally shocked. She's here? Oh my God. Get out of here.
Well, like, just... It's not like she was accused of, fraud or something. It's a pretty heinous...
I think, where did she go, what should she do?
Did you kill Elizabeth Bain on June the 19th, 1990? anyways, the answer to that is no, but